I know what you did.
That is not true. Please believe me.
The scream comes first, high, raw, cutting through the marble hallway of a house too big for grief to hide in. A boy's small fists pound against a locked bathroom door. Water is running on the other side. Nobody answers. Downstairs, a woman in a gray blazer stands frozen at the foot of the staircase, staring at her own trembling hands like she doesn't recognize them. And in the driveway, headlights are approaching fast. Too fast, because someone just called and said 3 words that changed everything. He's not breathing. Who is screaming? Who is on the other side of that door? And why, in a house with 14 bedrooms and a staff of 12, is no one moving to help? Before we go further, take a moment to subscribe, like this video, and tell me where you're watching from. It truly means a lot to see how far these stories connect with people around the world. Now let's go back 3 months, to the day this all began. Daniel Ashworth built an empire out of steel and glass. Ashworth Industries had offices in 9 cities, a name that made competitors nervous, and a founder who hadn't smiled in over a year. People in Denver's business circles used to call him the Wall, because negotiating with him felt like talking to concrete. What they didn't know was that the wall had been built the night his wife, Elena, died in a car accident on a rain-slicked mountain road 11 months earlier, with their son buckled into the back seat. Sam Ashworth was 7 years old, and he hadn't spoken a full sentence to an adult since the funeral. 17 nannies had come through the doors of the Ashworth estate in 11 months. 17. Some lasted a week. One lasted 4 hours. The boy didn't hit or scream at strangers. He did something worse. He disappeared into silence, and if anyone pushed too hard, he ran. Once, he climbed onto the roof of the guest house and sat there for 6 hours until the fire department came with a ladder. Daniel had watched from his office window, phone in hand, unable to make himself walk outside. His housekeeper, Marisol, who had worked for the family since before Sam was born, put it simply one evening as she poured Daniel his 3rd scotch of the night. "That boy isn't broken, Mr. Ashworth. He's waiting for someone he trusts enough to be broken in front of." Daniel didn't answer. He rarely did anymore. The 18th candidate was supposed to be different. She came with a folder of credentials so thick, the recruiter joked it needed its own chair. Dr. Amara Bennett, a child psychologist, specializes in trauma and grief in children under 12, based out of a practice in Charlotte, North Carolina. Before relocating west, she had turned down 2 other high-profile families that year. When Daniel's assistant first called her, she said no. "I don't do situations like this," she told him over the phone, her voice calm but firm. "Wealthy families hire me to fix their children like it's a home renovation. I'm not a contractor, Mr. Ashworth. I'm not interested in being the 18th name on a list." It should have ended there, but something about her refusal, the total absence of desperation, the fact that she didn't need his money, made Daniel Ashworth do something he hadn't done in almost a year. He got in his car and drove to her office himself. She kept him waiting 40 minutes in a lobby with peeling paint and a fish tank with one very tired-looking goldfish. When she finally called him back, she didn't stand, didn't shake his hand, and didn't offer coffee. "You drove 2 hours to convince a woman who already said no," she said. "That tells me either you're used to getting what you want, or you're desperate. Which is it?" "Both," Daniel admitted, and it was the most honest thing he'd said out loud in months. He told her about the roof, about the silence, about the 16 women before her who had tried bribes, tricks, and sticker charts, and one who'd tried yelling, as if volume could shake a 7-year-old out of grief. Dr. Bennett listened without writing anything down, which unsettled him more than if she'd taken notes. "What did you do?" she finally asked. "On the day of the funeral, when your son needed you the most?" Daniel's jaw tightened. "I gave the eulogy. That's not what I asked." The silence between them stretched long enough that the goldfish outside seemed to be the only living thing not holding its breath. "I let his grandmother hold his hand instead of me," Daniel said quietly, "because I couldn't stop shaking long enough to be the one he needed." Dr. Bennett studied him for a long moment. then finally opened her folder, not to review his son's file, but to close it. "I'll come for 2 weeks. Not as a nanny, not as staff, as a consultant, on my terms. And if at any point I think this house is more interested in optics than healing, I walk. Are we clear?" "Crystal," Daniel said, and for the first time in 11 months, something in his chest loosened just slightly. He should have felt relief. Instead, driving home that night, he felt something closer to fear, because deep down, he suspected this woman was about to see everything he'd been hiding from himself. The estate staff didn't know what to make of her. She arrived not with luggage from a designer brand, but with 2 canvas duffel bags and a box of art supplies. She wore sneakers instead of heels on her first walkthrough of the property, and when Marisol offered to carry her bags, she said, "I've got it, but thank you," and meant it. Sam wouldn't come out of his room the first day. Dr. Bennett didn't knock. She sat down cross-legged in the hallway outside his door with a sketchbook and started drawing, badly, deliberately badly, a lopsided dinosaur with too many legs, and narrated her mistakes out loud to no one in particular. "Well, that looks like a dinosaur that got into a fight with a spider and lost," she muttered. 20 minutes later, the door cracked open 2 inches. A single eye appeared in the gap. "Dinosaurs don't have that many legs," came a small voice. The first full sentence Sam had spoken to an adult in 11 months. "You're right," Dr. Bennett said, without looking up. "I'm terrible at this. Want to show me how it's actually done?" The door opened 3 more inches. It wasn't a breakthrough. Not yet. But it was a crack in a wall that 17 people before her hadn't even found. Meanwhile, in a conference room 40 floors above downtown Denver, a different kind of storm was gathering. Victor Lang, Daniel's business partner, and the man who'd co-founded Ashworth Industries with him 15 years earlier, sat across from 2 members of the board with a folder of his own, one that had nothing to do with a child's grief and everything to do with control. "Daniel's distracted," Victor said, sliding a document across the table. "He's missed 2 shareholder calls this month. He's letting a psychologist run his household like it's a science experiment. This is exactly the kind of instability the board should be concerned about." "You want to push a vote of no confidence?" one board member asked, eyebrows raised. "I want to protect this company," Victor said smoothly. "Whether Daniel's fit to keep leading it, that's a separate question. One I think we'll need to answer soon." What no one in that room knew was that Victor had a second reason to want Daniel distracted, buried in a filing cabinet 3 floors down. One that had everything to do with a set of documents Elena had signed 6 months before she died, and everything to do with it is why Victor had been so eager to volunteer as the family's trusted advisor ever since. Back at the estate, the 2 weeks Dr. Bennett had agreed to were almost up, and something had shifted that no one, not even her, had fully expected. Sam had started leaving small drawings under her door each morning, not of dinosaurs anymore, but of a woman in a car, a boy in the back seat, and, always, in the corner, a small son with a face that was either smiling or crying, depending on the day. Dr. Bennett kept every single one in a folder she didn't show anyone, not even Daniel, because she understood something the rest of the household hadn't grasped yet. Sam wasn't ready to have his grief interpreted by an adult. He needed it witnessed first. Then came the drawing that changed things. It showed the woman in the car, the boy in the back seat, but this time the driver's seat was empty, and a small figure stood outside the car in the rain, hand pressed against the window, unable to get in. "Who's that?" Dr. Bennett asked gently, sitting beside him on the floor of the playroom. Sam didn't answer for a long time. Then, so quietly she almost missed it, she said, "That's Daddy. He wasn't in the car, but he still got hurt." Dr. Bennett felt something crack open in her own chest. Not every wound in that house belonged to the child. That evening, she asked to speak with Daniel privately, the first time she'd requested a meeting on her own terms, instead of being summoned to one. "Your son isn't afraid of losing another mother," she told him, standing in his study while he remained seated behind a desk the size of a small boat. "He's afraid of losing you." Every time you disappear into work, every time you flinch away from him because looking at him reminds you of her, he registers that as abandonment. He's not grieving one parent, Mr. Ashworth. In his mind, he's slowly losing both. Daniel's hands, folded on the desk, went white at the knuckles. I don't know how to be around him without seeing her. Every time he laughs, it's her laugh. Every time he tilts his head, it's exactly how she used to. Then start there, Dr. Bennett said. Let him see you grieve. Do not perform strength for him. Grieve with him, because right now he's protecting you from his pain when it should be the other way around. It was the kind of truth that lands like a physical blow. Daniel sat in silence long after she left the room. If this story is hitting home for you the way it did for me while researching it, drop a comment and let me know. What's one thing you wish someone had told you sooner about grief? The 2-week agreement came and went, quietly, without either of them mentioning it. Dr. Bennett simply stayed, not as staff, not quite as family, something in between that didn't have a name yet. It was around this time that the household received unexpected guests. 3 of them, all women, all invited by Daniel's mother-in-law Eleanor, who had taken it upon herself to solve what she saw as the real problem in the house. Daniel needed a wife, and Sam needed a mother, and in her mind, a licensed psychologist in sneakers was not going to provide either. "You cannot raise that boy as a bachelor forever, Daniel," Eleanor said over dinner, while 3 carefully selected women, a hotel heiress, a former pageant queen turned philanthropist, and the daughter of one of Daniel's biggest investors, sat around the table like contestants who didn't yet know they were competing. Elena would want him to have a mother, a proper one, someone who can stand beside you at the shareholder gala, not someone in tennis shoes talking to him about feelings in the hallway. Daniel wanted to object. But the board pressure Victor had been quietly stoking for weeks had made its way to Eleanor's ears too, dressed up as concern. The company needs stability, the family needs stability, and Daniel needs to remarry to reassure the shareholders. And so, against every instinct telling him it was wrong, Daniel agreed to let his mother-in-law arrange a series of visits, an old-fashioned, thinly veiled audition for the role of Sam's new mother, disguised as friendly dinners. Sam hated it instantly. He barely spoke through the first dinner, pushing food around his plate while the pageant queen tried too hard, calling him champ in a voice that sounded rehearsed. The heiress spent the evening on her phone. Only the investor's daughter, Priya, seemed to genuinely try, asking Sam about his drawings, though even she seemed more interested in impressing Daniel than connecting with his son. Dr. Bennett watched from the doorway, arms crossed, saying nothing, because it wasn't her place, and because some part of her, one she hadn't examined too closely, felt something uncomfortably close to hurt. Later that night, Sam knocked on her door for the first time. Always before, she had been the one to sit outside his, and climbed onto the chair across from her, with his sketchbook clutched to his chest. "I don't want any of them," he said. "You don't have to want anyone right now," she told him gently. "This isn't your decision to make tonight." "Then whose is it?" She didn't have an answer for that. Neither, it turned out, did Daniel, who stood outside the cracked door, having come to check on his son, and heard every word. The strange events started small enough that anyone might have dismissed them. A missing folder from Daniel's home office. A late-night phone call that ended the moment he walked into the room. Marisol mentioned, almost in passing, that a courier had come to the estate gate asking for Dr. Bennett by name. Except Dr. Bennett hadn't ordered anything and had no idea who would be sending her anything at all. She noticed it before anyone else did, a woman trained to read the things people don't say out loud. There was a tension in the house that had nothing to do with grief. Marisol flinched every time Victor Lang's name came up. Priya, the investor's daughter, seemed to know details about the company's financials that a dinner guest shouldn't casually know, and Eleanor, for all her talk of Elena's wishes, changed the subject sharply whenever Dr. Bennett asked simple, curious questions about the will Elena had left behind. "Elena's estate matters were handled privately," Eleanor said one afternoon, a little too quickly, when Dr. Bennett mentioned it during a walk through the garden. "There's no reason for you to concern yourself with that." "I wasn't asking as a lawyer," Dr. Bennett said mildly. "I was asking as someone who noticed Sam gets quiet every time your name and his mother's are mentioned in the same sentence. Children absorb tension, even when they don't understand its source." Eleanor's smile thinned. "You're very good at your job, Dr. Bennett. Perhaps too good." It was said as a compliment. It didn't land as one. That night, Dr. Bennett did something she rarely allowed herself to do. She stayed up late in the guest house researching, not out of nosiness, but because something in her gut, the same instinct that had let her read a silent 7-year-old better than 16 professionals before her, told her that the tension in that house wasn't only about grief. It was about money, and someone was moving pieces on a board that Daniel didn't even know he was playing on. Before we keep going, if you've ever felt like you were the only one who noticed something everyone else was too distracted to see, hit that like button right now. This next part is for you. The turning point came on a Thursday evening that started ordinarily enough and ended with Daniel Ashworth standing in his own driveway, staring at a stranger's car he didn't recognize, feeling the ground shift beneath him for the second time in his life. Sam had a nightmare that night. The same one he'd had a dozen times since his mother died, the sound of rain against a windshield. Except this time, he woke up not screaming but crying quietly, the way a child cries when they've finally learned that someone will actually come if they call. Dr. Bennett came. She always came. She sat with him until his breathing slowed and sang, off-key and half-remembered, a lullaby her own grandmother used to sing to her back in North Carolina, not because she thought it would work, but because sometimes love doesn't need to be perfect, it just needs to be present. Daniel stood in the doorway and watched, unnoticed, for nearly 10 minutes. He thought about the eulogy he'd given, about holding it together in front of 300 people while his son sat 2 feet away, needing him to fall apart instead. He thought about 17 nannies who had tried to fix a wound with routines and rewards, and one woman who had simply sat on the floor and drawn a bad dinosaur. Something in him broke open that night, not violently, but like a door long rusted shut finally giving way. The next morning, he canceled his meetings, all of them. For the first time in 11 months, he took Sam to the park himself. No assistant trailing behind, no phone in his pocket. He pushed him on the swings until his arms ached and let his son see him laugh, really laugh, for the first time since the funeral. And when Sam asked, out of nowhere, "Do you miss Mom during the day too, or just at night?" Daniel didn't deflect. He sat down on the grass, pulled his son into his lap, and told him the truth. "Every single hour," he said, his voice breaking. "I miss her every single hour, buddy. And I'm sorry I've been so far away, trying to pretend I didn't." Sam didn't say anything. He just wrapped his small arms around his father's neck and held on, and for the first time in 11 months, neither of them let go first. Watching from a bench nearby, close enough to give them privacy and far enough to not intrude, Dr. Bennett felt tears she hadn't expected slide down her own face. This was the work, not fixing the boy, helping the father find his way back to him. But that same afternoon, back at the estate, everything came crashing toward a very different kind of reckoning. Victor Lang arrived unannounced, a folder in hand and a version of concern on his face that didn't reach his eyes. He asked to speak to Daniel privately, but Daniel, changed if only slightly by the morning at the park, refused to hide anything anymore. "Whatever you have to say, you can say in front of my son's psychologist," Daniel said. "She's not staff, Victor. She's family, whether the board approves or not." Victor's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Fine. Then she can hear this too. The board is calling an emergency vote next week, Daniel. There are concerns about your capacity to lead the company given your personal situation. And there's something else." He set the folder on the table. "Documents Elena signed 6 months before she died, transferring a controlling stake of her shares to a trust. A trust that names me as sole executor in the event of her death and your incapacitation." The room went cold. Elena would never. Daniel started. "She did," Victor said, sliding the papers forward. "Signed and notarized. I have no interest in causing you pain, Daniel. I only want what's best for the company we built together." It was Dr. Bennett, silent until now, who leaned forward and looked at the signature on the page for a long moment. She had spent years learning to notice details other people overlooked, a skill that came from studying children who couldn't tell you the truth in words, only in patterns. "This signature," she said quietly, "is dated the same week Sam mentioned in one of our sessions that his mother took him to visit his grandmother in Ohio for 8 days. You told me yourself, Mr. Ashworth, that Elena hadn't been in the state that entire week." Daniel's head snapped up. "That's right. She was in Columbus with her mother. I have the flight records." Victor's composure cracked for the first time, just a flicker, but Dr. Bennett had spent her whole career reading flickers. "Get the flight records," she said, "and get a forensic document examiner. Today." The next 72 hours unraveled everything. The flight records confirmed Elena had indeed been in Ohio the week the documents were supposedly signed in Denver. A forensic examiner, brought in quietly and quickly by Daniel's lawyer, confirmed within 2 days that the signature, while a close match, showed micro-inconsistencies in pressure and stroke pattern consistent with tracing, not an original signature at all. Victor Lang had forged Elena Ashworth's signature to seize control of a portion of the company, banking on the assumption that a grieving widower, drowning in loss and a struggling relationship with his son, would be too distracted to ever look closely enough to notice. He hadn't accounted for a psychologist who noticed everything, or a little boy whose memory of an ordinary trip to his grandmother's house became, unknowingly, the single detail that unraveled a scheme worth tens of millions of dollars. When confronted with the forensic report in front of the full board, Victor didn't even try to maintain the lie. He simply stood, straightened his jacket and said, "You were never going to notice on your own, Daniel. You've been gone for a year." Then he walked out, and within the month resigned from the board entirely, quietly settling to avoid criminal charges in exchange for surrendering his shares and severing all ties with the company. It should have felt like victory. Instead, Daniel sat in his study that night feeling something closer to grief all over again. Grief for the 15 years of friendship he'd trusted. Grief for how close he'd come to losing everything while he was too broken to see it. Dr. Bennett found him there, staring at nothing. "I almost lost the company because I couldn't get out of bed some mornings," he said quietly. "What kind of man does that make me?" "A human one," she said, sitting across from him. "The kind who was drowning and still managed to keep his son alive, even if some days it was just barely." "You didn't fail, Daniel. You survived something that would have broken most people completely, and now you're finally healing enough to see clearly again. That's not weakness. That's the hardest kind of strength there is. If you've ever had to rebuild trust after someone you loved betrayed you, or found strength you didn't know you had just to get through the day, let us know in the comments. I read every single one. With Victor gone and the company stabilized, the household exhaled for the first time in what felt like years. But one piece of unfinished business remained, hanging over the estate like a held breath. Eleanor's arranged dinners, and the quiet expectation that Daniel would choose a new wife from among the 3 women who had auditioned, unknowingly, for the role of Sam's mother. Eleanor called a final dinner, insisting the decision be made before the holidays, framing it, as she always did, as being in Elena's memory, though everyone in the room could feel it was really about appearances, about a widowed CEO needing a wife on his arm for the sake of the board and the gossip columns. Daniel, changed by the last several weeks in ways he was only beginning to understand, made a decision that surprised everyone at that table, including himself. "I'm not choosing anyone tonight," he said, standing at the head of the table, while 3 women who had spent weeks competing for a role they'd been told was open looked at him in confusion. "Not because there's anything wrong with any of you, but because I finally understand something I should have known from the start. This isn't my decision to make alone. It never was." He turned to his son, who sat quietly at the far end of the table, sketchbook in his lap as always. Sam. If you could choose anyone in the world to be there for you, not because someone arranged a dinner, not because the board wants stability, but because you trust them, because you feel safe with them, who would it be? The table went utterly silent. Eleanor's mouth opened to object, then closed again. Sam looked up. He glanced first at the three women who had tried so hard over the past weeks, then at his father, and finally at the woman sitting quietly near the kitchen doorway, not at the table, because she'd never once considered herself a guest in this competition, Dr. Amara Bennett, who had come only to check on him before bed and found herself standing in the middle of a moment she never asked to be part of. Her, Sam said simply, pointing. I choose her. The pageant queen looked stunned. Priya, to her credit, smiled softly, as if she'd suspected this outcome all along. Eleanor opened her mouth to protest that this wasn't how the evening was supposed to go, that a psychologist wasn't a suitable choice, that appearances mattered. Mother, Daniel said quietly, cutting her off with a gentleness that still carried unmistakable finality. Appearances didn't save my son. She did. I think it's time we let that matter more. Dr. Bennett stood frozen in the doorway, torn between every professional instinct she had, the ethical lines she had drawn so carefully, the distance she had tried to maintain, and the small boy now crossing the room to wrap his arms around her waist, saying words that undid every boundary she thought she needed. You don't have to leave when the 2 weeks are over, Sam said to her side. You can just stay forever. Is that okay? She knelt down to his level, and for the first time since she'd walked into that house, she let herself cry in front of someone else. I'm not going anywhere, sweetheart, she said. I promise you that. It wasn't a fairy tale ending, not exactly. Real healing rarely is. There was no dramatic wedding scene, no music swelling over a proposal. What happened instead was quieter, and somehow more powerful. Over the following months, Dr. Bennett stepped back from her clinical role entirely, transitioning the family to another trusted colleague for Sam's ongoing therapy, because she understood, better than anyone, that you cannot be both a child psychologist and his mother. The boundaries mattered. The love was real, but it had to be built honestly, in its proper place. She and Daniel took things slowly. Coffee that turned into dinner that turned into long conversations on the back porch after Sam went to sleep, and conversations about Elena that Daniel could finally have without flinching, because grief, handled honestly, makes room for new love instead of blocking it out. A year after that first bad dinosaur drawing in the hallway, Daniel Ashworth asked Amara Bennett to marry him, not at a gala, not in front of the board, but at the same park bench where he'd once told his son the truth about missing his mother every single hour. Sam stood beside them at the small backyard wedding months later, no longer the silent boy who ran to rooftops, but a child who had learned, slowly and honestly, that trust rebuilt is stronger than trust that was never broken at all. He held the rings himself, refusing to let anyone else carry them, and when the officiant asked if anyone objected to the union, Sam spoke up before anyone else could. I don't object, he said solemnly, and the small gathering of family and staff, Marisol included, wiping tears with the corner of her apron, burst into laughter through their tears. Eleanor, in the end, came around too, in the way that proud people sometimes do. Quietly, through actions rather than apologies, showing up more often, softening, until one afternoon she found herself teaching Sam how to bake his late mother's favorite recipe, the two of them covered in flour, laughing in a kitchen that had been too quiet for far too long. As for Ashworth Industries, it recovered fully once Victor's fraud was exposed and dealt with, but Daniel changed how he ran it, delegating more, working less, and leaving the office at 5 instead of 9, because he'd learned the hardest way possible that no company, no fortune, no empire of steel and glass was worth what he'd almost lost sitting right there in his own house the whole time. Before we close this one out, if this story moved you even a little, hit subscribe and share it with someone who needs a reminder today that healing is possible, even after the hardest losses. It means more than you know. Because in the end, This wasn't a story about a billionaire choosing a wife, or a company surviving a scandal, or even a boy choosing a mother. It was a story about a family that had to fall apart completely before it could learn to hold itself together again, and about how sometimes the person who saves you isn't the one with the most money, the most polish, or the most obvious claim to the role. Sometimes it's the person who sits on the floor outside a locked door, draws a terrible dinosaur, and simply waits, for as long as it takes, for someone in pain to finally open the door themselves. Thank you so much for watching this story all the way to the end. If it touched your heart even a little, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment telling us which part moved you the most. New stories drop every week here on Untold Maid Confessions. Real, emotional stories about the people who show up when the world looks away. Until next time, take care of each other.